Hi, my name is Rebecca Goodall. I am a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, where I teach mainly economics and valuation. Today I'm going to do a very short introduction to commercial property valuation for you, and specifically I want us to think about the impact that the coronavirus might have had on property values. So, valuation is seen to be the sort of cornerstone of our whole industry. If you're working in commercial property or property development, if you don't know what a building is worth, then the rest of the, every other business aspect becomes relatively unimportant. So if you choose to do a real estate course at university, you will do valuation in the first year, in the second year. At Nottingham Trent, you'd go away on a placement in the third year where you'd also probably do some valuation, then in your final year, and then again on your graduate training program until you sit your APC. So valuation really is that important. So how would you know how much a property is worth, what you might want to pay for it? Well, we have different methods for all sorts of different properties. So we could be valuing anything from a power station or a petrol station to a shopping centre or a property development. A lot of our methods tend to rely on the idea of looking at an income, if it produces an income, and then trying to attribute some sort of risk to that income. And that risk we normally reflect in something that we call a yield. A bit more about that in a minute. The most obvious method is called the income approach or income capitalisation approach. And it's super easy, so easy that I can show you in this quick video. There are a lot of different methods that are much more sophisticated than what I'm about to show you, but those methods still use this particular calculation within the wider calculation, if that makes sense. So, imagine there is a building that you bought at the beginning of the year of 2020, and it's got a tenant in it, and the tenant pays £100,000 of rental income per annum. In order to determine what you wanted to pay to buy that building, you had to think about what else you could have done with that money. You could have invested that money in shares and you would have collected a dividend. You could have invested that money in government bonds and you would have received a coupon payment. You could have invested that money into something completely different. So what kind of level of risk are you taking on for buying this particular property with a tenant paying £100,000? And how would you reflect that risk in terms of what you're prepared to pay for it? So what kind of risk might we be talking about? Well, we'd be thinking about the risk attached to the building. Is the building in a good state of repair? Is it about to collapse? Might you have to invest in a new air conditioning system? We are going to be thinking about the risk attributed to that local area. Is it a desirable area for, say, offices or for retail or for industrial units? Or is it an area that's not doing very well? It's not performing very well. What about the risk attributed not just to the local area, but the whole of the city or even the whole of the country? What about the currency risk attributed to that country? If you're investing in the United Kingdom, how do we feel about the pound sterling as a currency, for example? But a lot of the risk that we're also taking is attributed to the actual current tenant. That tenant has signed a lease, and that lease determines for how long the tenant should stay there and what kind of rent that tenant should pay. But are we comfortable about the tenant's future ability to pay? These are really hard questions, and to be honest, you can't easily put a number on those individual components. We kind of have to weigh them up in the round, so to speak. So a lot of valuation is really to do with your sort of intuition, but that intuition is based on years and years of expertise in a particular field. Let me give you a quick example. We bought this property that pays us, let's see if you can see that, £100,000 of rental income per annum. We've looked around, we've researched the market, we've thought about all of these alternative investment opportunities, we've compared it to similar buildings in the market, we've done our research, And we've worked out that the kind of return, the kind of yield we'd expect to get from this property would be in the region of, call it 5%. Now, what we can now do is we can take this 5 and, sorry, let's start again. We'll take the £100,000 and we can divide it by our yield. And that yield expressed as a decimal isn't 5%, but 0.05%. So what is 100,000 divided by 0.05? Well, the answer is 2 million. Hopefully you can see that okay. £2 million. So that's what we paid for this property that we bought at the beginning of the year. Now what happened then? Well, I'm afraid we've been in this lockdown for the last couple of months and the world is a very, very, very different place. So we now wanted to value our property. Let's say we wanted to sell the property to see what kind of value would somebody else pay us for it now. Might not be looking so good. And the first thing to think about is this rental income. Are we still actually getting £100,000? Hopefully you are, but to be honest, there's going to be a lot of tenants that might have held back their rental payments, or that might have negotiated some sort of payment reduction or some sort of holiday. But let's stick to that. Let's stick to that £100,000 for the moment. So what about that yield? Remember that yield is supposed to reflect the risk attributed to this property. Do we still think getting a 5% yield, a 5% return is adequate? Well, certainly not. The world is a bit of a nightmare right now. Well, let's start. From the wider economic perspective, we're not in a sort of status quo situation anymore. There's been talk about recessions, a global massive recession. We've already had horrific drops in GDP growth in the last quarter. So that's not looking so good. How do we feel about the UK as a whole? Well, sterling maybe isn't quite looking quite as stable anymore. What about the actual building itself? Surely that hasn't changed in 3 months. We had a strong, sturdy, appropriate building 3 months ago. Well, hey, even that might not be the case anymore. What might I mean by that? Look, there's been all this talk about have office buildings all of a sudden got enough lifts? If you're socially distancing from somebody, a building that's got lots and lots of lifts is going to be able to get the workers to those office floors much quicker than the building that might only have 2 lifts, if you can only have, say, 4 people in the lift at a time. So even our building itself, the actual structure of the building, might not be quite as suitable, or the layout of the building might not be quite as suitable anymore as it was 3 months ago. And what about our location? Well, probably the actual location hasn't changed massively in terms of popularity, although even that is something we could look into. What about if it's got, lots of access to, say, cycle paths? All of a sudden people are going to be cycling to work more, whereas 3 months ago everybody was happy to jump onto the tram or jump onto the tube. So our building might have changed, our location might have changed, the wider economy might have changed. I really, really could go on. And we're just worried about our tenant, the covenant strength of that tenant. Anyway, long story short, we are not going to be able to price this building at 5% anymore. We're just not. Let me just wipe the board. Let's say that we now have looked around, done our research, looked at the comparable evidence. We might actually think the yield is now 10%. Converted into a decimal, that's 0.1. If we now divide our £100,000 by 0.1, our building has dropped in value to £1 million. Because the idiom you need to remember is this: higher risk means higher yield, means lower value. So why would we want a higher yield? Well, we're not prepared to accept a low return on our now super, super risky investment. A low return might be something that you get leaving your money in the bank, or you might get a low return by buying a government bond. that pays the fixed income. If you're buying into something super, super risky, then you're going to want a higher return to remunerate you for that extra risk you're taking on. So if our yield had changed on this particular building from 5% to 10% in the last 3 months, then the value for our property has actually fallen from 2 million to 1 million pounds. That's pretty crazy, huh? But I tell you what, if you can get your head around that small calculation, that's half the battle won. You're almost ready to, hit the industry. Anyway, you've done a really, really great job sticking with me for so long and listening to all the other videos and all of the other content that's been put together for you. And I wish you a really happy summer and all the best in your future. Thank you for listening.